You need somewhere quieter to grieve, my daughter-in-law said as she placed my suitcases by the front door less than 24 hours after my husband's funeral. My son stood beside her without saying a word. I remember staring at those two navy blue suitcases like they belonged to someone else. One still had the airline tag from the trip Edward and I took to Cape Cod 5 summers ago. He had insisted on carrying it himself even though his arthritis was already getting bad back then. A gentleman carries his wife's bags, he used to say with that crooked smile that always made me laugh. But now the suitcase sat by the door like an eviction notice. The house smelled faintly of lilies from the funeral arrangements lining the dining room. Half-eaten casseroles filled the refrigerator. Sympathy cards still covered the kitchen counter. Everything around me looked like grief, but Vanessa had already moved on to logistics. The retirement apartments in Milford have an opening, she continued in that calm voice she used whenever she wanted to sound reasonable. It's probably better than staying here alone with all these memories. Memories. She said the word like it was clutter. Like 43 years of marriage could be boxed up and donated to charity. I looked at Daniel then, waiting for him to stop this. Waiting for my son to remember who I was. The little boy who used to crawl into bed during thunderstorms now stood with his hands in his pockets, staring at the hardwood floor like it had suddenly become fascinating. "Mom," he finally muttered. "It's just temporary until you figure things out." Figure things out. I had buried my husband 3 days ago. I still reached for his side of the bed in the middle of the night. That morning I had poured 2 cups of coffee before realizing one would stay untouched. And now they were talking about me like I was an inconvenience nobody knew where to store. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows overlooking the backyard Edward loved so much. He used to spend entire Saturday mornings out there trimming hedges while Frank Sinatra played from the old radio in the garage. Every inch of this house carried his fingerprints. The porch swing he built by hand. The brass drawer handles he polished every Christmas. The tiny crack in the hallway wall from when Daniel threw a baseball indoors at age 12. This wasn't just a house. It was the map of our entire life together. Vanessa crossed her arms gently, almost impatiently. "We already cleared space in the guest room downstairs for now," she said. "But honestly, Margaret, the stairs aren't safe for someone your age." Someone your age. I noticed she had started talking to me differently after Edward died. Slower. Sweeter. Like I was already halfway gone. I walked toward the front window without answering her. My reflection looked unfamiliar in the glass. 71 years old. Silver hair slightly undone. Black funeral dress hanging loose against my frame. A woman who had spent 4 decades building a family only to realize she no longer belonged inside it. Behind me, I heard Vanessa lower her voice. "Daniel, we need to finalize things before the realtor comes Monday." Realtor. The word hit me harder than the funeral had. I closed my eyes for a moment. Edward had promised me this house would always be mine. He said it so many times over the years that I never thought to question it. But standing there in the fading evening light with my suitcases waiting by the door, I suddenly realized something terrifying. Either my husband had been wrong about our son, or he had known something I didn't. I barely slept that night. The guest room downstairs smelled like fresh paint and lavender air freshener, neither of which belonged in my home. Vanessa had redecorated it sometime during Edward's hospital stay. Gone were the old bookshelves Edward built 20 years ago, and the framed family photographs that used to line the walls. In their place sat gray furniture that looked like it belonged in a hotel lobby. Cold. Temporary. Forgettable. Around 3 in the morning, I heard footsteps above me. Slow creaks crossing the hallway floorboards of the master bedroom Edward, and I had shared for more than 4 decades. For one disoriented moment my heart lifted. I almost believed it was him walking toward the bathroom in his worn slippers, the way he always did. But then I heard Vanessa laughing softly upstairs, followed by the sound of furniture being moved. She was already changing things. By sunrise I gave up trying to sleep. I walked quietly into the kitchen wearing my old blue cardigan, and found the coffee machine missing from its usual corner. Vanessa had replaced Edward's bulky stainless steel coffee maker with some sleek white machine that looked complicated enough to launch a spacecraft. Even the mugs were different. Our chipped ceramic mugs from Cape Cod were gone. The ones Edward loved because they kept coffee hot longer. I opened cabinets searching for them until I finally spotted them shoved into a box near the garage door marked donation. I stood there for a long moment holding Edward's favorite mug in my hands. Navy blue with a faded lighthouse painted on the side. The handle had a small crack from when Daniel dropped it during college break almost 15 years ago. Edward refused to throw it away. Some things do not need replacing just because they are imperfect, he used to say. Behind me, Vanessa walked into the kitchen already dressed in beige workout clothes that probably cost more than my monthly grocery bill. "Oh good, you are up," she said brightly. "The realtor is stopping by around noon to take preliminary photos." I turned slowly. "You already hired a realtor?" She opened the refrigerator and pulled out almond milk without even looking at me. "Well, houses in Fairfield County move fast this time of year. We need to be practical." Practical. That word again. Everything became practical once Edward was gone. Practical to move me downstairs. Practical to donate my things. Practical to sell the house before the flower arrangements from his funeral had even wilted. "Daniel agreed?" I asked quietly. Vanessa finally glanced at me then, and for the first time her smile slipped slightly. "Daniel trusts me to handle these things." That hurt more than I expected. Not because she answered for him, but because I knew she was telling the truth. My son had spent most of his life avoiding conflict. Even as a child he would apologize to bullies just to keep the peace. Edward used to worry about that softness in him. "A kind heart is wonderful," he once told me while we sat on the porch during a thunderstorm years ago, "unless someone cruel learns how to use it." At the time I thought he was talking about the world. Now I wondered if he had been talking about Vanessa all along. Around noon, I heard tires crunch across the driveway gravel. Vanessa immediately straightened a decorative pillow and smoothed her hair before heading toward the front door with a smile too polished to be real. But before she opened it, the doorbell rang once and Daniel's voice echoed from outside. "Mom," he called awkwardly. "There is someone here asking for you specifically." Vanessa opened the front door with the bright smile she reserved for wealthy neighbors and charity luncheons, but the expression faded almost instantly when she saw who stood outside. Harold Bennett adjusted his charcoal overcoat against the cold October wind and held a leather folder beneath one arm. I had known Harold for more than 30 years. He and Edward played golf together every summer at Black Rock Country Club, and every Christmas his wife mailed us homemade peppermint bark wrapped in silver ribbon. He was not just our attorney. He was part of the architecture of our life. "Margaret," he said gently, stepping inside. "I apologize for arriving unannounced." Vanessa recovered quickly. She always did. "We were actually just about to meet with the realtor," she said smoothly. "Perhaps another day would be better." Harold looked directly at her over the rim of his glasses. "This concerns Edward's estate, and specifically Mrs. Whitmore." Something shifted in the room after that. It was subtle, almost invisible, but I felt it immediately. Vanessa straightened slightly. Daniel stopped fidgeting with his wedding ring. Even the house itself seemed quieter, as though the walls were listening. Harold turned toward me with a softness that nearly broke my heart. "Edward requested that I speak with you privately if certain circumstances arose." I saw Daniel glance nervously toward Vanessa before speaking. "What circumstances?" Harold paused for only a second. The kind Edward believed might happen. After his death. Silence spread across the foyer. Heavy. Slow. Unavoidable. Vanessa forced a small laugh. "I am sure this can wait. Margaret has had a very emotional week." Harold did not even look at her this time. "No," he said calmly. "It cannot." He asked if we could use Edward's study. The request alone felt strange. Since the funeral, Vanessa had kept that room closed like a museum exhibit. Edward's leather chair still faced the window overlooking the backyard maples, and his reading glasses remained folded beside the lamp exactly where he left them before the heart attack. The air inside still carried traces of sandalwood aftershave and old paper. Familiar. Safe. Painful. Harold closed the door quietly behind us. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he removed a sealed ivory envelope from his folder and placed it carefully on the desk between us. My name was written across the front in Edward's handwriting. Margaret. Simple. Steady. Instantly recognizable after 43 years together. My throat tightened. Edward updated portions of the estate 6 months ago, Harold explained softly. He instructed me not to deliver this unless you were pressured to leave the house or denied authority within the estate. I stared at the envelope without touching it. Somewhere downstairs I could faintly hear Vanessa speaking in clipped whispers to Daniel. He knew. I whispered before I could stop myself. Harold's expression darkened slightly. Edward loved your son very much, he said carefully. But toward the end, he became concerned about certain influences around him. My hands trembled as I finally picked up the envelope. It felt heavier than paper should feel. Like it carried not only Edward's final words, but the answer to a question I had been too afraid to ask. Had my husband truly seen this coming long before I did? I sat alone in Edward's study after Harold quietly stepped into the hallway to take a phone call. The envelope rested in my lap while rain drifted softly against the windows overlooking the backyard. For a moment I could almost pretend none of this had happened. Edward's cardigan still hung over the back of his chair. His fountain pen sat uncapped beside an unfinished crossword puzzle. Everything in that room belonged to the version of my life that had existed before silence replaced love inside this house. My fingers traced Edward's handwriting slowly. He always wrote my name the same way, careful and steady, as though even ordinary things deserved tenderness. I finally opened the envelope with trembling hands and unfolded several pages neatly clipped together. The first line alone made my chest tighten. If you are reading this, my darling, then something has already gone terribly wrong. I had to stop for a moment after that. Tears blurred the ink, but I forced myself to continue. Edward explained that during the last year of his illness, he began noticing changes inside the family that disturbed him. Small things at first. Vanessa insisting on attending every financial meeting. Daniel avoiding conversations whenever money came up. Discussions about downsizing the house while Edward was still alive and sitting in the same room listening. He wrote about overhearing Vanessa one afternoon in the kitchen while she thought he was asleep upstairs. Once the house is sold, everything gets easier, she had told someone over the phone. Edward never wrote who she was speaking to. Maybe it did not matter. He said that was the moment he realized the house had stopped being a family home to her. It had become an asset. Something to acquire. Something to liquidate. My hand shook harder with every page. Edward admitted he had struggled for months over what to do because he loved Daniel deeply. Our son has a good heart, he wrote, but good hearts sometimes mistake silence for kindness. That sentence hurt more than anything else. Because it was true. Daniel had spent his whole life trying to avoid disappointing people, and somewhere along the way he became the kind of man who disappointed himself instead. Outside the study door I heard faint movement downstairs. Vanessa's heels clicking sharply across hardwood floors. Cabinet doors opening and closing. The ordinary sounds of someone rearranging a life that did not belong to them. Edward's final pages explained that most of the estate had been placed into a protected trust months earlier. The house, the investment accounts, even the vacation property in Maine. None of it could be sold or transferred without my direct approval. More importantly, the trust contained a condition Edward insisted Harold draft personally. If I was ever pressured, manipulated, or removed from the family home against my wishes, Daniel's inheritance would be indefinitely suspended. I stared at those words for a very long time. Not because of the money. Edward knew me better than anyone. He knew I would have given every dollar away just to keep my family whole. No, what shattered me was understanding how far ahead he had seen this coming. My husband had been quietly protecting me, while I still believed we were all sitting at the same dinner table as a family. At the very bottom of the final page, Edward had added one last handwritten sentence separate from the legal language. Margaret, if they ask you to shrink yourself to make their lives easier, do not do it. You spent 43 years building this family. Do not let them make you feel like a guest inside your own life. When I finally walked downstairs from Edward's study, the atmosphere inside the house had changed in a way I could feel immediately. Vanessa sat stiffly at the kitchen island with her laptop open beside several real estate brochures spread neatly across the marble countertop. Daniel stood near the sink pretending to scroll through his phone, but the tension in his shoulders gave him away. Harold remained calm beside the front window, one hand resting lightly on his leather folder as though he had seen scenes like this unfold many times before. Vanessa looked up first. Well? She asked with forced brightness. Did Harold answer your questions? I studied her quietly before speaking. It struck me then how young she suddenly looked beneath all the polished confidence. Not young in years but young in patience. Like someone accustomed to getting what she wanted quickly. He answered quite a few things, I said calmly. Daniel finally lifted his eyes toward me. For the first time since Edward's funeral, he looked nervous instead of detached. Mom, he started carefully. Maybe we should all sit down and discuss everything together. Together. The word almost made me smile. They had not wanted discussion when my suitcases appeared at the front door. Harold opened his folder slowly and removed several documents. Actually, he said in his measured voice, there are legal matters that need immediate clarification before any sale or transfer discussions continue. Vanessa crossed her arms. I do not understand why everyone is acting like this is complicated. Daniel is Edward's only son. Harold nodded politely. Yes. However, the estate was significantly restructured 6 months ago. The silence after that felt enormous. Vanessa blinked once. Restructured. Harold slid the paperwork across the counter toward Daniel first, but it was Vanessa who grabbed the pages. Her eyes moved quickly at first, then slower. Much slower. I watched the exact moment she realized the house did not belong to Daniel. The color drained from her face so gradually it almost seemed unreal. This cannot be correct, she said sharply. Edward would never cut his own son out. He did not, Harold replied evenly. But he did create protections to ensure Mrs. Whitmore could never be displaced from her home. Daniel looked completely lost now. Wait, he whispered, staring at the documents. What does suspended inheritance mean? Harold folded his hands carefully. It means if your mother is pressured to leave this property against her wishes, your access to the estate remains frozen indefinitely. Vanessa stood so abruptly her chair scraped hard against the floor. This is insane, she snapped before quickly softening her tone again. Margaret, you know we were only trying to help you. Help me. The same woman who packed my suitcases less than a day after my husband's funeral was suddenly speaking as though she had been performing community service. I looked toward the dining room where the funeral lilies still sat drooping in crystal vases. Their sweet scent had started turning sour. Everything beautiful eventually changes if left untouched long enough. Edward knew exactly what he was doing, I said quietly. Vanessa opened her mouth again, but no sound came out. This time, Daniel sank slowly into one of the kitchen chairs, staring down at the papers in front of him like they were written in another language. For the first time since my husband died, nobody in that house was treating me like a helpless widow. And the strange thing was I had not raised my voice once. Harold left shortly before sunset, carrying the same calm professionalism he had arrived with, but the silence he left behind felt louder than any argument. Nobody suggested dinner that evening. Vanessa disappeared upstairs almost immediately after the front door closed, her heels striking the staircase sharply enough to echo through the house like punctuation marks. Daniel lingered in the kitchen for a while, pretending to organize paperwork that did not need organizing. I could tell he wanted to speak, but guilt had always made him clumsy. Eventually he muttered something about needing air, and stepped out onto the back patio alone. I remained at the dining room table long after the light outside faded into deep blue. The funeral lilies drooped lower now, their petals beginning to brown at the edges. Edward used to replace flowers the moment they started wilting. Beautiful things deserve dignity all the way to the end, he once told me while trimming roses in the backyard. I looked around the room slowly. Every object carried him somehow. The grandfather clock he repaired twice himself instead of buying a new one. The tiny scratch on the dining table from Daniel's 8th birthday party, when the children played pirate ships using butter knives as swords. The brass chandelier we installed together after saving for almost a year when we were first married. Vanessa saw square footage and market value when she looked at this house. Edward and I saw a life. Around 8 o'clock I heard the patio door slide open. Daniel stepped back inside, rubbing his hands together against the cold. He looked exhausted. Older somehow. Mom, he said quietly without meeting my eyes. Can we talk? I nodded toward the chair across from me. He sat down slowly, staring at the untouched teacup in front of him. For several seconds neither of us spoke. Finally he exhaled hard. I did. Not know Dad changed everything like that. There was something almost childlike in his voice then. Not anger. Confusion. The kind little boys feel when they realize adults have secrets too. Your father did not change everything, I replied softly. He protected what mattered to him. Daniel swallowed visibly. Vanessa thought. He stopped himself halfway through the sentence. I almost pitied him in that moment. Almost. Vanessa thought the house would become yours after the funeral, I finished for him. He looked down immediately. That silence told me more than words could have. I folded my hands carefully in my lap to stop them from trembling. Did you know she planned to move me out before we buried your father? Daniel's face tightened. It was not supposed to happen that fast. Not denial. Not outrage. Just timing. I felt something inside me settle then, cold and permanent. Grief changes shape eventually. Sometimes it becomes clarity. Upstairs I heard cabinet doors slamming faintly in the master bedroom. Vanessa was angry now. Not because she had hurt me but because her plans had failed. Daniel rubbed his forehead tiredly. Mom, she was trying to help organize things. I looked at my son for a very long time before answering. Daniel, I said quietly, your wife packed my suitcases while your father's clothes were still hanging in the closet. He flinched slightly at that. Finally, a reaction. But even then he said nothing. That was the tragedy of it. Not cruelty. Not hatred. Just silence where love should have been. The next morning, the house felt divided in a way it never had before. Not loudly divided. Quietly. Like two different storms moving through the same walls. I woke early out of habit and stood in the kitchen watching pale October sunlight spread across the backyard. The maple trees behind the fence had started turning deep orange, and for one painful second I almost reached for my phone to tell Edward the leaves looked especially beautiful this year. We used to compete over who spotted the first signs of autumn. Small marriages are built from small rituals like that. Tiny things nobody notices until they disappear. Upstairs I heard Vanessa moving around long before Daniel woke up. Cabinet doors opened sharply. Drawers slammed harder than necessary. At one point I heard her pacing across the bedroom overhead while speaking in angry whispers on the phone. I could not make out every word, but I heard enough. No, everything changed after the lawyer came. Then silence. Then another sentence, tighter this time. Because apparently the old man planned ahead. The old man. Not Edward. Not her father-in-law. Just the old man. I wrapped both hands around my coffee mug and stared out the window a little longer. Strange how disrespect always reveals itself eventually. Sometimes it just waits until grief lowers the lights enough for people to stop pretending. Around 9 o'clock Daniel finally came downstairs wearing the same wrinkled sweater from the night before. He looked exhausted. Vanessa followed several minutes later, perfectly dressed as always, but something brittle had entered her expression overnight. Her smile appeared too quickly now, like someone flipping on a lamp in an empty room. Margaret, she said brightly. I was thinking maybe we all got off on the wrong foot this week. I nearly admired how fast she adjusted strategies. Yesterday I was a burden. Today I was Margaret again. Grief affects everyone differently, she continued while pouring herself green juice into a tall glass. I know emotions have been high. Daniel remained silent near the refrigerator. That silence again. Endless. Predictable. Vanessa pulled out a chair and sat across from me like we were girlfriends discussing brunch plans instead of a woman who packed my belongings before the funeral flowers wilted. Maybe we should start fresh, she said softly. This house means so much to all of us. There it was. Not you. The house. I looked down at Edward's mug in my hands before answering. You are right, I said calmly. This house does mean a great deal. Vanessa relaxed slightly, mistaking composure for surrender. Edward used to warn me about that too. Quiet people scare the wrong kinds of people, he once said, because they never know whether silence means weakness or patience. The doorbell rang unexpectedly around 10. Vanessa's entire posture stiffened immediately. Daniel walked to answer it while she watched from the kitchen with barely concealed tension. A moment later I heard another familiar voice in the foyer. Morning, Daniel. Harold Bennett stepped inside carrying a second leather folder. Vanessa's smile disappeared completely this time. Harold removed his coat slowly before speaking. I apologize for returning so soon, he said politely. But the bank contacted me this morning regarding several attempted access requests on restricted estate accounts. The room went completely still after that. I looked toward Vanessa. She had gone pale so quickly it startled even me. Daniel frowned in confusion. What access requests? Harold glanced down briefly at the folder in his hands before answering. Requests submitted late last night using your household credentials. Then he looked directly at Vanessa for the first time since entering the kitchen. Mrs. Whitmore, would you care to explain why you attempted to move funds from an estate trust you legally cannot access? Vanessa recovered faster than most people would have. I will give her that. For half a second after Harold's question, panic flashed openly across her face. Then it vanished beneath polished composure so quickly another person might have missed it entirely. But grief sharpens certain instincts, especially in women who have spent decades reading rooms before speaking inside them. There must be some misunderstanding, she said smoothly, folding her arms as though she were the reasonable one in the room. I was only trying to organize the accounts after Edward passed away. Harold remained perfectly still. You attempted 3 separate transfers at 11:42 last night. Daniel looked between them in confusion. Transfers to where? Harold opened the folder and adjusted his glasses. 2 external investment accounts and 1 luxury property escrow account in Aspen. Silence crashed into the kitchen after that. Heavy. Final. Daniel slowly turned toward his wife. Aspen, he repeated quietly. Vanessa exhaled sharply through her nose. Oh my God, Daniel, it was an inquiry, not a transfer. Harold is making this sound criminal when it was just financial planning. Financial planning. The phrase almost made me laugh. Edward had once told me that people reveal themselves most clearly when money and disappointment collide. I understood what he meant now. Daniel ran one hand across his face slowly. Why would you even look at estate money right now? He asked her. My father died 4 days ago. For the first time since I met her 12 years earlier, Vanessa lost control of her tone completely. Because somebody in this house has to think ahead, she snapped. Do you know how expensive this property is to maintain? Taxes alone are almost $30,000 a year. There it was again. Numbers. Square footage. Market value. Every conversation led back to assets with her eventually. Harold closed the folder calmly. Fortunately, Mrs. Whitmore does not need to worry about maintenance costs. Edward arranged lifetime protections for all household expenses. Vanessa stared at him. Lifetime. Including utilities, staffing, insurance, landscaping, and medical support if necessary. I watched the exact second realization settled over her. The house was never slipping away from me. She had simply assumed it would. Daniel leaned heavily against the counter now like the room itself had become unstable beneath him. You knew about Aspen? He asked quietly. Vanessa looked at him with disbelief. Daniel, do not do this. We talked about investing before. Not with my mother's money. The sentence came out sharper than anything I had heard from him in years. Vanessa blinked once, clearly stunned by his tone. Strange how little resistance it sometimes takes to shock controlling people. They become accustomed to silence so quickly that even basic honesty feels like betrayal to them. I stood slowly from my chair and carried my empty coffee mug toward the sink. Nobody stopped me. Nobody spoke. The kitchen suddenly felt smaller than ever before despite its vaulted ceilings and polished marble counters. Maybe because the performance had finally cracked. Maybe because everyone could finally see the truth standing naked in the middle of the room. I rinsed Edward's mug carefully, beneath warm water before drying it with the same striped dish towel we had used for years. Then I turned back toward my son. Daniel, I said softly, your father spent 43 years building a life for this family. My eyes shifted briefly toward Vanessa. Some people inherit homes. Others inherit values. Sadly, those are not always the same thing. That evening the house felt unfamiliar in a way grief alone could not explain. It was no longer simply a home where my husband had died. It had become a place where masks no longer fit properly. Vanessa stayed upstairs for most of the afternoon after Harold left again. I could hear drawers opening and closing above me, followed by long stretches of silence broken only by muffled phone conversations behind closed doors. Daniel remained downstairs, pacing between the kitchen and living room like a man trying to outrun his own thoughts. Around sunset, I carried a blanket onto the back porch and sat alone on the old cedar swing Edward built during our 25th wedding anniversary. The October air smelled like rain and fallen leaves. Across the yard, the garden lights flickered softly beneath the maple trees Edward planted the year Daniel graduated high school. He used to say trees were acts of faith. You planted them knowing someone else would someday sit beneath their shade. I wondered if he knew then how lonely that shade could become. The porch door slid open quietly behind me. Daniel stepped outside holding 2 mugs of tea. For a moment the sight almost broke my heart, because it reminded me so much of his father. Same careful hands. Same tired eyes when guilt weighed on him. He handed me 1 mug before sitting cautiously at the far end of the swing. Chamomile, he said quietly. The way Dad used to make it. I nodded once without speaking. Crickets hummed faintly from the far end of the yard, while traffic moved somewhere beyond the neighborhood in distant waves. Daniel stared into his tea for a long time before finally speaking again. I did not know she tried to access the accounts. His voice sounded smaller than I remembered. Not defensive anymore. Just exhausted. But you knew she wanted the house, I replied softly. He closed his eyes briefly. That was answer enough. Mom, he whispered. Things got complicated after Dad got sick. I looked out toward the darkening yard. No, I said gently. They became clearer. The porch swing creaked softly between us. Daniel rubbed his hands together against the cold the same way he used to after Little League games when he was nervous about disappointing his father. Vanessa thought we could renovate, he admitted carefully. Maybe sell eventually and move somewhere larger closer to the city. Larger. As though people eventually outgrow homes filled with love the way children outgrow sneakers. And where exactly was I supposed to go while you built your larger life? He flinched at that question harder than I expected. Finally he looked at me directly for the first time in days. His eyes were red around the edges now. I never wanted you hurt. The sadness that moved through me then felt strangely calm. Not sharp anymore. Just tired. Daniel, I said quietly. The worst part is not what Vanessa did. He frowned slightly. Then what is it? I wrapped both hands around the warm mug and listened to the wind moving softly through Edward's trees. It is that somewhere along the way, my son watched me become smaller in my own home and convinced himself that silence was kindness. He looked down immediately after that. I could almost see the weight of those words settling onto him piece by piece. Inside the house upstairs, a suitcase zipper closed sharply. Then another one. Daniel heard it too. We both sat very still listening to the sound echo faintly through the ceiling. After a long silence, he finally spoke again, barely above a whisper. I think Vanessa is leaving. I stared out into the darkness beyond the porch lights for several seconds before answering. No, I said softly. I think she already left a long time ago. We just did not notice until the money disappeared.